The United States military involvement in the Middle East is a difficult topic to cover. The history behind it can be as confusing as it is emotional, which is hardly surprising after all. It is a matter of life and death. And on top of that, the issue is ongoing. The US is currently bombing and/or occupying territory in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. It can be hard to analyze an event that is still happening, particularly when most of the information coming out of the Middle East is being reported by the same people who are bombing it. One common method of making sense of war is to make art about it. And if you have enough money, you can even make a movie about it. There are lots of movies about war in the Middle East, but I've chosen to take a look at 3 that have been nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars: The Hurt Locker, Zero Dark 30, and American Sniper. Obviously, these movies aren't automatically superior because of their Academy Awards nominations, but I do think these nominations make them worth taking a closer look at. This is because the Oscars have always been a pretty good measure of what the American film industry thinks of, well, film. The awards are informative in the same way as asking a prolific music producer what their favorite albums are. It can give you an idea of how Hollywood sees itself. Now, if we're going to talk about these movies, I think some historical context is needed. The movies themselves sort of assume you get the gist of the history around the events that they depict. Although it's also pretty clear that these films have a very particular view of that history. Of course, it's impossible to talk about history without bringing your own biases into the mix, especially recent history. And I can understand if you wouldn't trust a lowly film YouTuber to talk to you about historical events. So I've invited a close friend of mine. He's a history YouTuber, so you can and should take him at his word. Given his credentials, I expect to see 0 criticisms or corrections in the comments. Thanks. God damn it. Okay, so the United States has been mixing things up in the Middle East for quite a long time. In fact, it's been mixing things up all over the world for its entire existence. It's important to understand its overall behavior internationally if we want to understand its behavior specifically in the Middle East. Over the past couple of generations, the United States has justified war with 2 basic ideas. 1, we are protecting our freedoms, and by extension our country. And 2, we are spreading democracy. The spreading democracy thing is almost always a lie. The US government isn't particularly interested in democracy or even voting as a concept. If you've ever voted in the United States, you probably know what I'm talking about. The United States is perfectly happy to ally with a dictator or to overthrow a democracy if it suits its interests. In fact, that exact thing happened to Iran in the 1950s. Iran's elected prime minister nationalized their oil industry, which was bad news for business in the West. So the United States and the United Kingdom wasted no time overthrowing that democracy and instead installing a monarch. The United States has used less direct methods as well, simply funding militants who seek to overthrow governments that have made business difficult for America. One of the most famous examples of this is when the United States funded and trained the Contras in Nicaragua, a group of right-wing insurgents who were responsible for some truly gruesome atrocities. Many of the coups and interventions enacted by the United States are chalked up to a fear of the spread of communism or socialism, which is partly true. Anti-communist sentiment has been strong in the United States since, well, the idea of communism. But I would argue the root cause is more related to economics. Socialism and communism do not mean the death of democracy, and in fact many leftists would argue that those systems require democracy to even function. But what those ideologies do result in is the death of private industry. Any nation moving in the direction of socialism is going to have to reappropriate some capital from the capitalists. And if a country has a lot of important resources within its borders, like oil for example, that country can gain a lot of political leverage by reappropriating those resources. This threatens US businesses, as well as global capitalism. So, in a sense, America's first argument for supporting war, that they're protecting their freedoms, is the truth. Just they aren't protecting the freedoms of their own citizens, at least not all of their own citizens. What they're really protecting is the freedom of wealthy citizens to do business in a free market, to own their own capital, and to own their own capital overseas. Mix that with a robust military-industrial complex, which we do not have time to get into today, and you have a pretty good reason to go to war. It keeps the US economy turning. This is what people mean when they refer to the United States as an imperial power. It's not an empire in the classical sense. The US isn't trying to set up new colonies or try to get Iranians to call themselves Americans or anything. Instead, it has placed military bases all around the world and ensured that it has access to as many resources as possible. Any countries that don't play nice with American businesses, well, you've seen what happens. I'm sure you've seen takes by people who say that America sees itself as the world police because it thinks it knows what's best for the world. But that's not the real reason. America, like any government, acts in self-interest, policing the world because it knows what's best for itself. This style of foreign policy falls under the umbrella of neoconservatism. Even American leaders who don't consider themselves neocons end up supporting or perpetuating conflicts that neoconservative ideas led us to. And I would wager most neoconservatives would agree with what I've said so far, other than the part about democracy and communism. The core of neoconservative ideology is that America should be imperialist, that we should police the world, if only to avoid being policed by another country. It applies the competitiveness and self-centeredness of free market capitalism to its foreign policy. This ideology, strangely enough, doesn't seem to jive with the American people. The average American tends to be against war, or at least new wars. This put neoconservative President George W. Bush in a bit of a pickle in the year 2000. You see, the United States wanted Saddam Hussein gone. He had been friendly with the US in the past, but ever since Iraq invaded Kuwait in the 90s, he had been on thin ice with the US government. Also, Iraq has a lot of oil, just saying. The US placed sanctions on Iraq after the Gulf War, in an attempt to cripple their economy and force a regime change without actually having to send in any more troops. In addition to the sanctions, the Iraqi government was forced to destroy any weapons of mass destruction that it had in its possession. And beginning in 1998, the US and the UK began bombing Iraq to further pressure Saddam's regime. But the US still didn't have any boots on the ground in Iraq in the first 8 months of Bush's presidency. It's hard to convince people to send their children to war in a country that doesn't seem to impact them. That changed after the 9/11 attacks killed almost 3,000 people on American soil. And there you go, suddenly the United States government had a really good reason to invade Iraq. I'm kidding, of course, the Iraqis had nothing to do with the attacks on September 11th. In fact, the only government you could really connect the attacks to in any meaningful way was Saudi Arabia, but they were already our allies, so they got let off the hook. So the Bush administration, along with its intelligence agencies, lied. They tried to tie Iraq, Iran, and North Korea to the attacks. And they claimed that Iraq still had weapons of mass destruction. Now, at this point, many Americans were itching for war, or at the very least some feeling of justice after the 9/11 attacks. Government officials and journalists alike were spreading the lie about WMDs, and in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. It's difficult to measure the tragedy that was the Iraq War. This is partly due to its highly political nature. Those who started it don't want to look too closely at the damage that was caused. Due to this, as well as the general chaos that comes with a war, casualties have been estimated from anywhere between 100,000 deaths and over 1 million. Many civilian casualty estimates number in the hundreds of thousands. The standard of living and health of the Iraqi people has never returned to what it was before the US invasion. And if Will had only watched The Hurt Locker and American Sniper, that would about cover it. But he had to go and watch Zero Dark 30 as well, so that means we have to talk about Pakistan. As a historian, I can assure you that US-Pakistani relations are very boring. So I'll keep it short. The governments of the United States and Pakistan have been frenemies for most of their existence. Relations were bad when Pakistan elected its first leftist leader in the 1970s. Relations improved when the CIA was allowed to use Pakistan to train Mujahideen fighters in the Afghan Civil War. Relations have generally been a nervous peace between the two nations. The US has several military bases in Pakistan, but you can't really say they're occupying it either. It's the imperialist version of your older brother sticking his finger in your face and saying, "I'm not touching you." You could say that Pakistan hasn't been entirely cooperative with the United States, but if a strange man with a gun took up residence in my apartment, I wouldn't be too nice to him either. Well, that about sums it up, at least for the sake of this video. The US was at war in Afghanistan before the Iraq War even started, and has been stirring the pot in places like Yemen and Syria for quite a long time now. But I'll spare you the details, at least until Will watches any movies set in those countries. Now, if you have any history questions for me, please keep them to yourself. On to you, Will. Thanks, History Will. That was very informative. So, the first movie I want to talk about is American Sniper. It's the most recent of the three, and it's the film that gave me the idea for this whole video. The experience I had, compared with the experience of general audiences as well as the Academy, seemed to be shockingly different. This movie is terrible. Like, it isn't even a so bad it's good situation. The characters are uninteresting, the action is boring and has no stakes, and on top of it all, the movie has politics that are kinda gross. American Sniper is about the life of Chris Kyle, a Navy SEAL sniper who served 4 tours in the Iraq War. And not just any sniper. Kyle is known as the most deadly sniper in US military history, with around 150 confirmed kills. In the film, we start off with his early life. We see Chris's father teaching him how to hunt and instilling him with the worldview that he carries with him for the rest of his life.
There are 3 types of people in this world: sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. Now, some people prefer to believe that evil doesn't exist in the world, and that if ever darkened their doorstep, they wouldn't know how to protect themselves. Those are the sheep. And then you got predators. They use violence to prey on the weak. They're the wolves. And then there are those who've been blessed with the gift of aggression and the overpowering need to protect the flock. These men are the rare breed that live to confront the wolf. They are the sheepdog. And we're not raising any sheep in this family. And I will whoop your ass if you turn into a wolf.
Wayne. What? No, this is a great environment for you.
This is the core message of the movie. Kyle is a sheepdog, protecting his flock from the wolves that would do them harm. Eventually, he is inspired to join the Navy SEALs after the 1998 bombing of 2 US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, notably the moment Al-Qaeda was introduced to the American public. We get the obligatory training montage, and before you know it, 9/11 happens. 2 years later, Chris is sent to Iraq, where his first kills are a woman and a young boy. The pair were trying to attack a group of Marines with an anti-tank grenade. Still, we see Chris struggling with the decision, whispering to himself, begging them not to make him kill them. After that, we see Chris kill a bunch more people. He feels very protective of his fellow soldiers, feels personally responsible whenever they die, so he resolves to kill as many enemy combatants as possible. Speaking of enemy combatants, there's a scene where a superior claims that the city of Fallujah has been evacuated and that any military-aged male is here to kill you. This is a complete lie. While US troops may have been told this, Fallujah was never effectively evacuated, and you can't really just invade a country and demand its citizens evacuate their homes in the middle of a war. So the term enemy combatants is doing a lot of work here. Anyway, Chris eventually catches wind of one of our villains, known as the Butcher. He kills people with a drill because he's crazy. Chris tries to get information about the Butcher from some guy whose house he raided. The man, under duress, gives up information about the Butcher, and later the Butcher finds out and kills his son with a drill and then shoots the informant. Sheepdog. The Butcher isn't the only villain either. We also have Mustafa, an enemy sniper who has reached legendary status just like Chris. You would think this would lead to some really cool sniper versus sniper scenes, but the scenes are actually just really boring, unfortunately. It's hard to have much tension in his sniper scenes when his whole reputation is the guy who never misses, and he's portrayed in the movie as the guy who never misses. The SEALs end up occupying a man's home when they believe that the Butcher is hiding out next door. The man is cooperative at first, but Chris gets a bad vibe about him and eventually discovers that the man has hidden a cache of weapons under his floorboards. The SEALs take this to mean that the man is working for the Butcher, and they force the man to lure the Butcher out of his safe house. Their plan goes poorly. The man ends up dead, and the Butcher escapes, never to be seen again. Now, the movie clearly sees the guy with the weapons as bad. It has no qualms about our good guys using him as bait. But when you look at it, his situation is much more complicated than just good or bad. The man is living in an active war zone with his immediate family. His country has been invaded, and on top of that, the invaders are literally forcing their way into his home. He's clearly been either dealing or just hiding weapons, but in this scenario, things like weapons and food are probably the most valuable assets you can have. His motivations are clear. If he has weapons, he might have enough resources to keep his family alive. What I'm saying is, there's a lot of moral gray area here, and the movie totally ignores it. This becomes a theme, really, for all of these movies. There are a few moments in this film where it comes this close to giving some nuance to Chris. One of Chris's friends confides in him that he no longer supports the war that they're fighting. He doesn't understand why they're there, and he's just sort of going through the motions of being a soldier. Later in the film, the squad makes some mistakes and ends up in a firefight that gets Chris's friend killed. After the funeral, Chris blames his friend's death on his lack of conviction and patriotism.
Chris, I want to know what you thought of his letter.
And then we just walked right into an ambush. But that's not what killed him. That letter did. That letter killed Mark. He let go and he paid the price for it.
Insisting that his friend would have survived if he had never doubted the war in Iraq. Now, this could have been an excellent low point for Chris's character, falling into anger and jingoism after the loss of a dear friend. But this opinion of his is never once challenged in the film. He seems to believe this for the rest of his life, and the film presents that as either good or at least neutral. Even after his final tour, when his PTSD is at its worst and he's finally gone to therapy, Chris claims that his emotional scars are not from the people that he killed, but rather the thing that haunts him is the American soldiers that he couldn't save. He is completely unable to frame the war in Iraq as anything but a necessity, even a force of nature. Americans were, by default, going to be there, and he was just defending his own. This characterization is frustrating and a little frightening. And it could be really compelling, but the film doesn't seem to know what it's doing. It insists that Chris is heroic and correct. I feel like I should clarify that I'm only really talking about movie Chris Kyle here. I don't really care if he was like this in real life or not. This movie isn't a biography. Characters like the Butcher and Mustafa are entirely fabricated. I'm judging this movie based on how it works as a movie, as a piece of art. That being said, if you want to laugh, look up the story about Jesse Ventura suing Chris Kyle for defamation. Very funny story. So, I was hoping American Sniper would be the worst movie I had to watch for this video, but I was very, very wrong. Zero Dark 30 is a boring nightmare. Over 2.5 hours of CIA agents arguing with each other, punctuated by scenes of torture and gunfire. If you didn't already know, Zero Dark 30 is about the hunting and killing of Osama bin Laden. You can't really spoil this one. It somehow manages to have characters that feel even less human than the characters in American Sniper. Like, at least Chris felt sad when he gunned down a child. Zero Dark 30 has a lot of torture scenes. It seems to want to show how horrible torture is, but at the same time it argues for its usefulness. In the plot of the film, it's torture that helps catch bin Laden. There are scenes of CIA agents complaining that Abu Ghraib and Gitmo fucked us when Obama started making anti-torture statements. In Zero Dark 30, torture is the answer, along with a good helping of a massive surveillance program on an unsuspecting population. And if they could have tortured more and had more powers of surveillance, bin Laden would have been killed even faster. Our main character, Maya, is one of the least relatable characters I've ever seen. And it's weird because they try to make her story kind of feminist. Like, she's trying to catch bin Laden, but people aren't listening to her because she's a woman. Which, like, I'm sure is a thing in the CIA. It happens in any office setting. But Maya is a bloodthirsty maniac who no one should listen to ever. When she discovers where bin Laden might be, she says that she would prefer to use a bomb rather than a SEAL team, even though they have confirmed that civilians are living in the compound, and they have no hard evidence that bin Laden is even there. Of all these movies, Zero Dark 30 feels the most like it was just written by the CIA. It's obvious propaganda, but it isn't even entertaining propaganda. There isn't really much action in the movie, and it only takes place at the very end where they actually kill bin Laden. The most entertaining part is when they accidentally crash one of their helicopters like right on top of his compound, which really happened, by the way. Anyway, the action isn't that interesting or tense. We know what happens, of course, and the Americans are portrayed as so dominant the whole time that there really isn't any tension. I guess that's kind of the problem when making propaganda when you're already a world superpower. It's hard to have any meaningful stakes in your films, and if you give your characters flaws or arcs, then you have to be willing to admit that the people running your empire are flawed. So the closest Zero Dark 30 can come to its main character having a flaw is she's so dedicated to killing Osama bin Laden that she is really stressed out about it. Of course, she has plenty of other flaws, most of them involving extrajudicial killings and torture, but the movie frames these as positive, or at least necessary. And that's about all I have to say about Zero Dark 30. It's just awful. Don't watch it. Our last movie is a breath of fresh air, at least compared to the first two, which is kind of shocking because its director, Catherine Bigelow, also directed Zero Dark 30. The Hurt Locker is far and away the most engaging of the three. It's about a bomb squad on tour in 2004 Iraq. At the opening of the film, the squad's leader is blown up by an IED that was detonated by a man with a cell phone. A member of the squad hesitated to kill the man with the detonator, so he feels responsible for the death of their leader. It feels pretty similar to the scene in American Sniper where he shoots the kid, but at least in this movie it sets up an obstacle for a character to overcome. Also, the scene is just presented really well. Really, all of the defusal scenes are very tense. One of my favorite parts of them is Bigelow's decision to throw in a ton of background noise. You'll hear jets and helicopters zooming by overhead on some unrelated mission. They're incredibly loud, and when you're waiting for a bomb to go off, they really put you on edge.
What? Hey, this ain't a fucking meet and greet. Now get out of here.
Don't get me wrong, The Hurt Locker is a long way off from framing the Iraq War in a politically responsible way. It's still pretty imperialist, full of invaders feeling sad about how hard it is to invade. But if you look past these bad politics, there's still a good movie in here. It's thought-provoking, tense, and entertaining. It's the only one of these films even close to earning its Oscar nomination, although I think Inglourious Basterds or A Serious Man should have won that year. Anyway, the bomb squad's new leader is Sergeant James, and Sergeant James has some issues, particularly when it comes to self-preservation. He's defused literally hundreds of bombs in his career and has developed a pretty cavalier attitude when it comes to pulling wires out of a bomb.
Sergeant Sanborn is asking if you'll please put your headset back on. That's a negative. That's not gonna happen.
This understandably freaks his squad mates out. The Hurt Locker succeeds where American Sniper failed at depicting a complicated relationship that soldiers can have with violence and danger. Sergeant James, like Chris Kyle, has marriage problems due to his absence from going on tour, combined with personality changes brought on by being in combat. It's strange that Sergeant James's story is so much more compelling when Kyle's condition and beliefs are probably much more common in the real world. But The Hurt Locker just presents its characters with a more frank and judgmental tone that makes its characterization more effective. Funnily enough, there's a sniping scene in The Hurt Locker that is better than any sniping scene in American Sniper. Instead of having our characters never miss a shot and just pick the enemy apart, the sniping scene in The Hurt Locker is a disaster.
All right, you're a little left.
It starts with the bomb squad and a group of allied mercenaries taking fire and losing a few of the mercs in the process. So the squad ends up in a day-long standoff with the enemy snipers. Both sides miss constantly, and the whole fight just seems miserable and dirty. There's a great moment where they need to reload, and the only ammo they have left is covered in blood from one of the dead mercenaries. So the squad member who let their previous leader get blown up is tasked with cleaning them off. He's clearly at his least confident in this scene. So Sergeant James coaches him through this nightmare situation. We get to see these two characters grow together in a genuinely tense scene. American Sniper never even comes close to this. The Hurt Locker is also the most critical of the military of any of these films. It isn't very charitable in its depiction of any of its characters. They're all pretty broken people in their own way, and it's clear that the war is the thing that broke them in the first place, or it has exasperated issues that they already had. It's to the point where this movie feels pretty anti-war, although its reasons for being anti-war seem to be centered around the mental health of American soldiers. rather than maybe the idea that America is making a bad situation worse by even being there. But when it comes to movies like this, maybe I can't be too picky. I mean, we know the Pentagon thought it was anti-war too. Let me explain. There's this program the United States military has where if you're making a movie and you want to use military hardware in your shots, helicopters, Humvees, stuff like that, you can borrow them at a reduced or even no cost from the Pentagon. Pretty good deal, right? Well, the catch is that the Pentagon gets to edit your script. So if there's something in the movie they don't like, you either have to change it or pay full price, or risk losing access to that hardware at all. It's a sort of soft propaganda system. They're not ordering anyone to do anything, because they don't have to. All they need to do is provide a financial incentive to play nice with the US military. And this happens a lot, especially in blockbuster movies. The Transformers series being the biggest example that comes to mind. And as it turns out, The Hurt Locker had to deal with the Pentagon as well. That is, until they started shooting scenes that weren't in the script.
He's not gonna make it.
If we leave here in 15 minutes, we got a survivable wound, sir.
He's not gonna make it.
Scenes that the Pentagon was not too happy about, apparently, because they pulled all their support from the movie once they found out. So The Hurt Locker exists in an interesting space, too critical of the Iraq War in the eyes of the Pentagon, but still firmly from an imperialist perspective. I think it's telling that this movie was the most entertaining to me. Even the slightest amount of nuance feels like a breath of fresh air. When I started making this video, I honestly wasn't sure where it was going to take me. Sometimes I like to pick a rough idea and sort of explore it as I watch and write. And I'm honestly a little surprised where I landed. I was assuming I'd find nothing positive about these films, no potential for anything but boring propaganda. But instead my takeaway is that America's relationship with its wars in the Middle East and its military in general tends to hold its films back. There's a lot of potential in movies about war. There's life and death stakes, action, tragedy, politics, loss, all things that can make for good stories. Imagine the story you could tell about even the most ordinary soldier going to war in Iraq. Most people in the US join the military for money or opportunity. It's America's largest jobs program. The military essentially relies on children with no economic prospects to join up when they turn 18. If that 18-year-old signs up and a year later ends up invading Iraq, how culpable is he for the damage that's being done? How much responsibility does the recruiter share, or the guy who put the tires on his Humvee? Everyone around my age who I've met who's joined the military has joined for economic reasons, not due to any sort of patriotic savior complex. American Sniper and The Hurt Locker each attempt to tackle PTSD. What happens when someone is genuinely suffering from committing incredibly immoral acts? Can we derive any meaning from that? I don't know. These questions might not have straight answers. But movies can be a way to explore topics like this. And for other wars, movies have done exactly that. But as far as Hollywood is concerned, America's wars in the Middle East remain a little too fresh on everyone's minds. Which is funny because any stress about those wars is entirely self-inflicted. So to finally get to the point, American war propaganda holds films back from the most interesting stories that come out of the modern US military. Which I guess is one of the less pressing issues brought on by the American imperialist project. And I'm not someone who really thinks that if these movies all had perfect politics, they would change the world or anything. Movies tend to reflect the world that they're made in more than they influence it. But I would like to see movies about the wars of this century held to a higher standard. These movies were all nominated for Oscars and they mostly suck. The Hurt Locker was good, not great, and it won Best Picture. And worse than that, each of these movies had a ton of potential. And when I see a good story turned into a mediocre movie, I can't help but be disappointed. Thanks for watching. Hi again, I just wanted to jump in at the end of the video to plug my new podcast. It's called Jump Cuts, and you can listen to it on Spotify, Apple Music, pretty much anywhere you would listen to podcasts. And also thank you for 300 subscribers. I think I hit that like today, so really cool milestone. Thank you so much for subscribing, and goodbye.